October 12, 1944. 6:47 a.m. A 1,000-pound bomb screams through the morning sky above Tainan Airfield, Taiwan, and detonates directly on the main runway. The explosion tears a crater 25 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Chunks of concrete fly like artillery rounds. A Japanese Zero fighter, fully fueled and armed, catches the blast wave and erupts into a fireball so intense that ground crews 200 meters away feel the heat burn their faces. Before the smoke clears, another bomb hits. Then another. Then 12 more in 60 seconds. A base that took 3 years to build is becoming rubble in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. And nobody in Tokyo saw it coming. Here is the number that should stop you cold. 8 aircraft carriers. 480 combat aircraft. 15 minutes. That is the gap between the moment Japanese radar first detected Task Force 38 approaching Formosa and the moment American bombs began falling on every major airfield on the island simultaneously. 15 minutes to scramble fighters. 15 minutes to organize a defense. 15 minutes to stop the most powerful mobile strike force in the history of naval warfare. They could not do it. By the time the sun reached midday on October 12, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Second Air Fleet had lost 230 aircraft. Every fuel storage depot on Formosa was burning. Runways were cratered across 6 separate bases, and the Americans had lost less than 4% of their strike force doing it. But to understand how America built a machine capable of destroying an entire island's air defenses in a single morning, you have to go back further. You have to understand what the world looked like before Task Force 38 existed, and you have to meet the men whose obsession, arrogance, and refusal to accept conventional wisdom made it all possible. In the summer of 1942, the United States Navy was losing the war in the Pacific. Not slowly, not quietly, catastrophically. The Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, with 6 carriers and 414 aircraft. They had sunk or damaged 18 American warships in 90 minutes. They had destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground. They had killed 2,403 Americans before breakfast. The Pacific Fleet, the shield of the entire Western Ocean, had been paralyzed in a single morning strike. And the Japanese had done it using a principle that American naval planners had spent 20 years dismissing as theoretical fantasy. Carriers were the weapon. Not battleships. Carriers. The United States entered the war with 7 fleet carriers operational across both oceans. Japan had 10. More importantly, Japan had the pilots. Experienced, aggressive, brilliantly trained aviators who had been flying combat missions in China since 1937. The average Japanese carrier pilot in December 1941 had 800 flight hours. Many had over 1,000. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft so maneuverable and so long-ranged that American pilots who first encountered it in combat refused to believe the performance reports. Their commanders thought the eyewitness accounts were exaggerated. They were not. The situation in the first 8 months of the Pacific War was brutal. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, America lost the carrier Lexington. At Midway in June, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day, but America lost the Yorktown. At Guadalcanal in August, Japan sank the carrier Wasp and damaged the Saratoga. By October 1942, the United States had exactly 1 operational fleet carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean, 1 ship carrying approximately 90 aircraft against the largest naval empire in the history of Asia. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, looked at the map in his Washington office and understood the mathematics with cold clarity. America could not outfight Japan carrier for carrier in 1942. The experienced pilots were gone or dying. The ships were sunk or damaged. The only path to victory was one that Japan could not follow, because Japan did not have the factories, the steel, the workers, or the time. America would have to outbuild them. In the Newport News, shipbuilding yard in Virginia, in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, in the Bethlehem, Steel facility in Quincy, Massachusetts. Something extraordinary was already happening. Workers were arriving before dawn and leaving after midnight. Women who had never held a welding torch were laying armor plate on carrier hulls. Engineers were solving in weeks problems that naval architects had previously spent years studying. The shipyard at Newport News alone was operating 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, with a workforce that had tripled in size since December 1941. The ship they were racing to complete was the Essex-class aircraft carrier, displacing 27,000 tons fully loaded, 320 meters from bow to stern, capable of 33 knots in open ocean, designed to carry 90 aircraft, built with a self-sealing fuel system, armored flight deck sections, and anti-aircraft gun batteries, so dense that later models bristled with over 60 individual gun positions. The Essex was not merely a ship. It was a mobile airfield that could reposition itself 300 miles overnight and strike at targets that shore-based aircraft could never reach. The keel of USS Essex herself was laid on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year after the attack, from keel to combat ready in 20 months. Her sister ship, Yorktown CV-10, named deliberately for the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned 4 months later. Then Intrepid, then Hornet, then Wasp CV-18, then Hancock, then Bennington, then Shangri-La. The yards delivered them faster than the Japanese could track the names. Japan's Taiho, their most advanced fleet carrier, took 3 years and 2 months to build. America's Essex-class took 16 months. Japan built 1 Taiho. America built 24 Essex-class carriers during the war. These are not rhetorical numbers. These are the numbers that explain why Task Force 38 existed in October 1944, with 8 carriers pointed at Formosa, when Japan could barely keep 4 operational carriers at sea anywhere in the Pacific. But the ships were only half the equation. The other half was the men who flew from them. In Pensacola, Florida, the Naval Air Station was running training programs at a tempo that had been considered literally impossible before the war. Flight instructors who had themselves trained for 3 years were now pushing cadets through abbreviated programs, teaching the essential skills in months instead of years. The Navy and Marine Corps were commissioning over 2,000 new aviators every single month by 1944. Most of them were young men barely out of high school, products of a country that had woken up angry on December 8, 1941, and had not stopped moving since. These pilots were learning to fly the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter aircraft that the Grumman Engineering Corporation had designed specifically to kill the Zero. When American pilots first encountered the Zero in combat and survived to report what happened, Grumman engineers did something remarkable. They listened. They took every performance report, every combat account, every specification that intelligence could provide about the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, and they built a machine designed to exploit the weaknesses and neutralize the strengths. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero. It was less maneuverable in a tight turning fight. It did not matter. The Hellcat was faster in a dive. It was faster at high altitude. It was vastly more durable. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition, and it had armor plate behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks, features the Zero lacked entirely because the Zero's designers had sacrificed protection for range and agility. The result was an aircraft that transformed the war in the air. A Zero hit by a 50-caliber burst usually burned immediately. The unprotected fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. The pilot without armor was often killed by the first rounds that penetrated the cockpit. A Hellcat hit by a Zero's 20mm cannon might absorb the damage, keep flying, and the pilot might pull out of the engagement and land safely. The asymmetry was decisive. American pilots arriving on fleet carriers in 1944 had roughly 300 flight hours in training. Their Japanese counterparts, the survivors of 4 years of attrition warfare, might have more combat experience, but were increasingly rare. The new Japanese pilots being pushed through accelerated training programs to replace the dead had fewer than 100 hours total. Some had fewer than 70. They were being sent into combat in aircraft they barely knew how to land, against opponents who had already survived 30, 40, 50 engagements. By the autumn of 1944, the kill ratio in air combat over the Pacific was running at better than 6-to-1 in America's favor. For every American fighter pilot shot down, Japan was losing 6 pilots it could not replace. Captain Toshikazu Omai understood all of this. He understood it the way a surgeon understands a fatal diagnosis with perfect clinical clarity and zero ability to change the outcome. On the morning of October 12, 1944, when the reconnaissance report arrived at 2nd Air Fleet headquarters in Formosa, and he read the words, 8 carriers, 480 aircraft, 180 miles east, northeast, he did not panic. He had been waiting for this report. He had known it was coming since the moment American carriers started systematically destroying Japanese air bases across the Central Pacific one by one, like a man working his way down a list. Truk in February, Palau in March, the Marianas in June. Each time Japanese commanders had received reconnaissance reports of approaching American carriers. Each time there had been 15, maybe 20 minutes between detection and the first bombs. Each time the defenders had scrambled everything they had into the air, taken catastrophic losses, and watched their carefully prepared bases turned into craters and wreckage. Formosa was next, and Omei had been assigned to defend it. He looked at the plotting table where his petty officer was marking the American position with a grease pencil. He calculated the distance. He calculated the speed. He calculated how long it would take for 480 American aircraft to cover 160 miles of open ocean at 220 knots. He arrived at a number, 25 minutes. He had 25 minutes before the first wave arrived over Formosa's coastline. In those 25 minutes, he needed to scramble 250 fighters from 6 different airfields, spread across an island 80 miles long. He needed those fighters to climb to 25,000 feet form, into coherent defensive formations, and be in position to intercept a strike force that outnumbered them nearly 2-to-1, and that was being guided to their position by radar systems Japan could not match or jam. He picked up the telephone. He knew the mathematics. He had known them for months. The Americans could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them. They could produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. Every engagement, every battle, every desperate scramble, like the one happening right now across Formosa's 6 airfields, was drawing down Japan's finite reserves of planes, pilots, and fighting capacity, while barely scratching the surface of America's industrial output. But he picked up the telephone anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and 22 years of service in the Imperial Japanese Navy had not prepared Toshikazu Omai for surrender before the bombs started falling. What happened in the next 6 hours over Formosa would confirm every calculation he had already made. 230 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Every major airfield damaged or cratered. Fuel storage burning from one end of the island to the other. And somewhere in the wreckage of what had been 2nd Air Fleet's operational capacity, a lesson so brutal and so clear that it would reshape Japanese military strategy for the final year of the war. But right now, at 6:47 on the morning of October 12, 1944, the bombs are still falling on Tainan Airfield. The Zero is still burning, and the most powerful mobile strike force in the history of naval warfare is just beginning its work. In Part 1, we watched Task Force 38 appear off Formosa like a ghost from the industrial future. 8 carriers launching 480 aircraft in 15 minutes, erasing Japan's 2nd Air Fleet before noon. We watched Captain Omei pick up the telephone, knowing the mathematics were already decided. 230 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Every airfield burning. And the question hanging in the smoke was simple and merciless. How did America build something this unstoppable? The answer begins not in the admirals' conference rooms in Washington. It begins in the flight simulators of Pensacola, Florida, in 1943, where a 26-year-old lieutenant named James Flatley was writing a training manual that his commanding officer was about to throw in the trash. Flatley had a problem that nobody senior to him wanted to acknowledge. American pilots were dying at a rate that the Navy's official statistics did not fully capture, because the official statistics measured only aircraft losses, not the qualitative collapse happening inside the cockpits. The pilots surviving their first 10 combat missions were learning. The pilots dying in their first 3 missions never got the chance. And in 1942 and early 1943, the ratio of experienced pilots to new arrivals was catastrophically backward. Veterans were being stretched across too many squadrons, too thin, unable to pass their knowledge down before another deployment rotation pulled them away. New pilots were arriving in combat with technically adequate flying skills and tactically suicidal habits. Flatley had spent 14 months compiling what he believed was the solution. A systematized doctrine of carrier-fighter combat written not in the language of naval bureaucracy, but in the language of a pilot who had actually been shot at. He called it coordinated section tactics. The principle was straightforward. No pilot ever fights alone. 2 aircraft operate as a single unit, one attacking, one covering. 4 aircraft operate as 2 pairs mutually supporting. A squadron of 12 operates as 3 interlocking sections, each capable of independent action, but always within radio range of the others. The enemy, whether Zero or any other aircraft, cannot attack one American pilot without exposing himself to another. He presented his manual to Commander Harold Bauer in October 1943. Bauer read 12 pages and set it down. "Flatley," he said, "we have a standardized doctrine. We have been flying carrier fighters since 1927. You are 26 years old, and you want me to replace 16 years of established procedure with a pamphlet you wrote between deployments. Sir, I want you to read the casualty analysis on page 31. I have read enough." Bauer slid the manual back across the table. "Pilots die in combat. That is the nature of combat. What you are proposing would require retraining every squadron in the Pacific Fleet. The logistics alone would set our operational tempo back 6 months. The current casualty rate among pilots in their first 5 missions is 43%, sir. 43%. Bauer looked at him for a long moment. "Dismissed, Lieutenant." Flatley walked out of that office with his manual under his arm and the strong possibility of a career-ending mark in his service record. He had one option left. It was unconventional. It was technically insubordinate. And it was the only move available to a junior officer who was absolutely certain he was right and running out of time to prove it. He went to find Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mitcher commanded carrier air operations in the Pacific and was by 1943 the most experienced carrier aviation officer in the American Navy. He had been flying off carriers since the 1920s. He had commanded the Hornet at Midway. More importantly, he was a man who evaluated ideas based on evidence rather than rank a quality rare enough in military hierarchies to be genuinely dangerous to bureaucratic comfort. Flatley had met him once briefly at a tactical briefing in Pearl Harbor. He had no appointment, no introduction, and no standing to request one. He requested one anyway. Mitcher saw him the following morning. He read the manual in 35 minutes, while Flatley sat across the desk and said nothing. When Mitcher looked up, his expression had not changed, but he asked a specific question about the radio communication protocols in Section 3, which meant he had understood the doctrine well enough to identify its critical dependency. "If we implement this," Mitcher said, "every fighter pilot in the Pacific Fleet needs 72 hours of ground training before we can evaluate it in the air. I can give you one air group, 6 weeks. You design the training program. You run it yourself." If the kill ratio improves by 30% in the first operational deployment, I take it to King. If it does not, this conversation never happened, and you go back to your squadron. 1 air group, 6 weeks. 1 chance. The training program Flatley designed ran from November through December 1943 aboard USS Yorktown, C-5-10 anchored at Pearl Harbor between deployments. 72 hours of ground school, followed by 60 hours of practice sorties, every pilot flying the section tactics, until the movements were reflexive rather than deliberate. Radio discipline, altitude stacking, target assignment before engagement. The concept of energy management, preserving altitude and speed for the killing pass, rather than wasting both in turning fights where the Zero held the advantage. The pilots hated it for the first 2 weeks. Fighter pilots are by professional temperament individualists. The entire mythology of aerial combat from the First World War through every Hollywood film produced in the 1930s celebrated the lone ace, the single pilot of supernatural skill who triumphed through personal brilliance. Flatley was telling them that personal brilliance was a liability. That the pilot who broke formation to chase a kill was the pilot who died with a 0 on his tail that he never saw coming. On the 14th day of training, a senior pilot named Lieutenant Commander Edward Vrachu flew a practice intercept against a simulated Japanese formation, and his section of 4 Hellcats achieved simulated kill positions on all 8 target aircraft in 4 minutes and 12 seconds without losing a single man. Under previous doctrine, the same intercept scenario typically resulted in 2 or 3 simulated losses and took 7 to 9 minutes. Vrachu climbed out of his cockpit and looked at Flatley on the flight deck. "Run it again," Flatley said. They ran it 4 more times that afternoon. The average engagement time was 4 minutes 30 seconds. Simulated losses averaged 0.2 per intercept. The numbers were not 30% better than the previous doctrine. They were 300% better. Mitcher's staff watched the final practice run from the carrier's island superstructure. Nobody said anything for a long moment after the last aircraft landed. Commander Bauer, who had been invited to observe, turned to the officer standing next to him and said with the specific flatness of a man revising his judgment, "Get Flatley up here." The doctrine was approved for fleet-wide implementation in January 1944. The training program was replicated across every carrier air group in the Pacific Fleet over the following 4 months. By June 1944, every fighter pilot launching from an Essex-class carrier had completed Flatley's course. The timing was not accidental, it was precise. Because in June 1944, Task Force 58, the same force that would become Task Force 38 by October, engaged the Japanese carrier fleet in the Philippine Sea in what became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese launched 473 aircraft in coordinated strikes against the American task force over 2 days. They expected to overwhelm American defenses through numbers and determination. What they encountered instead was Flatley's doctrine deployed at scale. American fighter directors using radar vectors positioned Hellcat sections at altitude advantages before the Japanese formations arrived. Coordinated section attacks shredded the incoming strikes before they reached the carriers. Japanese pilots, who had trained for months to execute the attack, found themselves engaged from above and behind before they could identify the carriers as targets. American pilots, who would previously have died in the first turning engagement, survived because their wingman was already in position to kill the Zero before it completed its pass. 473 Japanese aircraft launched. 395 were shot down. The Americans lost 29. The kill ratio was not 6-1. It was 13-1. Task Force 38 approaching Formosa in October 1944 carried those pilots flying that doctrine equipped with Hellcats designed to exploit Japanese vulnerabilities and radios that allowed them to coordinate in real time. When Captain O'May scrambled 250 Japanese fighters off Formosa's airfields on the morning of October 12th, he was not sending them against the American carrier aviation of 1942. He was sending them against the distilled product of everything Flatley had built. Every modification Grumman had made, every radar system the Navy had installed, every training hour invested in every pilot circling above the Philippine Sea. The air battle over northern Formosa lasted 23 minutes. Japan lost 53 aircraft to America's 9. The ratio matched the Philippine Sea almost exactly because the variables were the same. Superior aircraft, superior doctrine, superior radar, overwhelming numbers of pilots who knew exactly what to do and exactly how to do it together. But here is where the story turns in a direction that Tokyo had not anticipated and could not counter. Because Task Force 38 was not finished with Formosa after one morning. The carriers recovered their aircraft, rearmed, refueled, and launched again. A second strike of 400 aircraft hit the island at 11 in the morning. A third strike launched before sunset. The same carriers that had destroyed 230 Japanese aircraft before noon were preparing to do it again before dinner. And somewhere in the signals traffic flowing between Formosa and Tokyo that evening, a Japanese intelligence officer noted something that made the report he was writing feel like a death notice for a strategy rather than a battle. The Americans were not withdrawing after the strike. They were maintaining station. They intended to come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Japan could replace a building. It could fill a crater in a runway given enough time. What it could not replace, what no amount of concrete or timber or labor could restore, were the pilots burning in the wreckage of 230 aircraft scattered across Formosa's airfields and coastal waters. Those men were years of training, years of accumulated experience, years of irreplaceable human capital that Japan had spent 3 years consuming faster than it could produce. In Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyoda read the initial damage reports and reached for a different kind of mathematics. Not the mathematics of aircraft lost versus aircraft available. The mathematics of what Japan would have to sacrifice in the Philippines to keep the Americans from doing this to every remaining base in the Western Pacific, one island at a time, every 15 minutes. What he decided next would change the shape of the entire war, and it would send the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled directly toward a battle it could not win in waters. It could not control against a force that would be waiting precisely because Task Force 38 had done its work over Formosa so completely and so thoroughly that Japan had no choice left but the desperate move. The carriers are still on station, the pilots are still flying, and the worst is still coming. 2 parts in, and the scoreboard reads like a fever dream from 1941. Task Force 38 destroyed 230 Japanese aircraft over Formosa in a single day. James Flatley's coordinated section tactics turned the Philippine Sea into a 13-to-1 killing ground. The Essex-class assembly lines were delivering carriers faster than Japan could track the names. America had built a machine that could appear off any coastline in the Western Pacific, launch 480 aircraft, and be gone before the smoke cleared. But here is the number that changes everything about what comes next. After Formosa, Admiral Soemu Toyoda in Tokyo looked at his remaining carrier fleet and counted 4 ships with barely enough trained pilots to fill 2 air groups. 4 carriers against 17. And he made a decision so desperate that American intelligence analysts reading the decoded orders assumed the translation was wrong. It was not wrong. And the battle it triggered would be the largest naval engagement in the history of warfare. In the combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo, the reaction to Formosa was not grief. It was calculation. Toyoda understood with perfect clarity that Japan could not win a carrier battle against Task Force 38. The Turkey shoot in the Philippine Sea had demonstrated that with a kill ratio so lopsided, it bordered on mechanical rather than military. 395 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 2 days. Flatley's doctrine had turned American fighter squadrons into systems rather than collections of individuals, and systems did not panic did not break formation, chasing glory, did not die because they forgot to check their six. Japanese intelligence had been tracking the changes since late 1943. They had recovered enough wreckage from downed Hellcats to understand the aircraft's structural advantages. They had interviewed enough surviving pilots who had engaged American fighters to understand that something fundamental had shifted in how American squadrons fought. The individual American pilot was not necessarily better than his Japanese counterpart in raw skill. But the American formation was categorically superior to the Japanese formation because it was designed around the assumption that no individual was invulnerable and that every pilot needed a partner covering his blind spots. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa submitted a report to Toyota in early October 1944 that was, by the standards of Imperial Japanese Navy communication, remarkably direct. Japanese air groups could no longer conduct effective offensive operations against American carrier task forces. The defensive fighter screen alone, directed by radar and coordinated by radio, was capable of destroying any strike force Japan could assemble before it reached attack position. The numbers from Formosa confirmed what the Philippine Sea had already proven. Japan was losing pilots at a rate approximately 8 times faster than it could produce replacements. Within 6 months, at current attrition rates, the carrier air groups would effectively cease to exist as a fighting force. Toyota read the report and set it aside. Then he drafted Operation Show 1. The plan was audacious in the way that only desperate plans can be audacious. Japan's 4 remaining carriers with their skeleton air groups would sail south from Japan and position themselves northeast of Luzon. Their purpose was not to fight. Their purpose was to be seen. To be detected by American reconnaissance to appear threatening enough that Halsey would take Task Force 38 north to engage them, pulling the American carriers away from the Leyte Gulf invasion beaches. While Halsey chased the decoy 2 separate Japanese surface forces, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, would converge on Leyte Gulf from the west and south and destroy the American invasion fleet at anchor. It was a plan that accepted the destruction of its own carriers as the price of entry. Ozawa's carriers were bait. The pilots flying from them knew it. The admirals commanding them knew it. And they sailed anyway, because the alternative was to watch the Philippines fall without attempting to stop it, which meant watching the oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies get cut, which meant watching Japan's fleet die at anchor within a year from fuel starvation. The Battle of Leyte Gulf began on October 23, 1944. It involved 282 warships across 3 separate engagements, spread over 4 days and more than 100,000 square miles of ocean. The numbers alone make it the largest naval battle in history. But the specific engagement that demonstrated exactly what Task Force 38 had become happened on October 24 in the Sibuyan Sea, where the Central Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was making its approach toward the San Bernardino Strait. Kurita's force was formidable by any historical standard. 5 battleships including Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. The Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded and carried 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling a shell weighing 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. There was no surface force in the world that could engage Kurita in a straight fight and survive. There was no surface force in the world that needed to. At 0800 on October 24th, American search aircraft from Task Group 38.2 located Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea, 300 miles from the invasion beaches. Admiral Mitcher ordered 5 successive strikes launched throughout the day. What followed was the demonstration of everything the last 3 years of American industrial production, tactical development, and pilot training had built toward. The first strike of 21 aircraft arrived over the Central Force at 10:26. Helldivers rolled into their dives from 18,000 feet. Avengers ran their torpedo approaches at 200 feet above the water throttles full forward, the pilots holding their course through anti-aircraft fire that filled the air around them with black smoke and shrapnel. Musashi. The most heavily armored ship afloat took 4 bomb hits and 3 torpedo hits in the first strike and kept moving. She was designed to absorb punishment that would sink anything else. The second strike arrived at 1200. Musashi took 3 more torpedoes and 2 more bombs. The third strike hit at 1330. 6 torpedoes, 4 bombs. The fourth strike, 7 more torpedoes. By mid-afternoon, Musashi had absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits. Her bow was underwater. Her crew was fighting fires across 3 decks simultaneously. At 1535, she rolled to port and sank, taking approximately half of her crew of 2,200 men to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. The largest warship Japan had ever built, the physical embodiment of the pre-war battleship doctrine that had dominated naval thinking for 50 years, had been sunk by carrier aircraft without a single American surface ship coming within visual range. Kurita turned his remaining force around and retreated west. His flagship Yamato had taken 2 bomb hits but remained operational. His other battleships were damaged to varying degrees. More importantly, his formation had spent the entire day under air attack with no ability to strike back at the carriers, launching the strikes because the carriers were 300 miles away and moving. The pilot who flew the final strike against Musashi, Lieutenant Commander George Glacken of Intrepid's Air Group, wrote in his after-action report with the economy of a man who has seen something that does not require embellishment. Target no longer maneuvering. Torpedo hits observed both sides. Ship listing 40 degrees and sinking. Returning to base. 11 words to describe the end of 72,000 tons of the finest steel Japan had ever produced. Halsey, meanwhile, had done exactly what Toyota needed him to do. He had taken Task Force 38 north toward Ozawa's decoy carriers and spent October 25th destroying them, which was not difficult because Ozawa had barely enough aircraft to defend against a single strike, let alone the full weight of 17 carriers. Ozawa lost all 4 of his carriers. He had expected to lose them. It was the price of the plan. The cost of Halsey's absence from Leyte Gulf was nearly catastrophic. Kurita, having turned around again after learning Halsey had gone north, came through the San Bernardino Strait in the early hours of October 25th and fell upon a force of small escort carriers and destroyers protecting the invasion transports. What followed was the Battle off Samar, where destroyers and destroyer escorts with 5-inch guns charged a battleship force to protect the carriers behind them, and where the escort carrier pilots flew attack runs with empty bomb racks after exhausting their ordnance because making attack runs with empty bomb racks was the only thing left to do. Kurita, uncertain of his tactical situation and rattled by the ferocity of the defense, turned away before destroying the invasion fleet he had come to destroy. The Philippines were not saved by perfect execution. They were saved by the accumulated weight of everything Task Force 38 had done to Japan's air power before the battle began, and by the extraordinary courage of sailors fighting a battle that no doctrine had prepared them for. By the time the guns went quiet at Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. Japan had lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Philippines were lost. The oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies were cut. The surface fleet that remained was ordered to conserve fuel and avoid engagement, which meant that the ships that had cost decades of Japanese industrial output to build would spend the remainder of the war sitting in harbors waiting for the end. The strategic tally of what Task Force 38 and its predecessor Task Force 58 had accomplished between February and October 1944 was this: 17 Japanese carriers sunk or destroyed. Japanese carrier aviation reduced from a viable offensive force to a decoy. 700 aircraft destroyed over Formosa alone. The defense of the Philippines dismantled before the invasion fleet arrived. American carrier losses in the same period: 0 fleet carriers sunk by enemy action. James Flatley was promoted to commander in November 1944. The citation mentioned his contribution to carrier fighter doctrine. It did not attempt to quantify what that doctrine was worth in the currency that matters in war, which is lives. The mathematics suggest the number was very large. But there is a final chapter to this story that the after-action reports and the official citations and the historians who counted the ships and aircraft do not fully capture. It is the story of what all of this meant for the men on both sides who lived through it, and what it means for how nations build power and project it across oceans. What happened after Leyte Gulf in the waters around Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and finally off the Japanese home islands themselves, is the chapter that explains why the decisions made in Newport News shipyards and Pensacola flight schools, and a carrier deck in Pearl Harbor, still matter today. That chapter is next. 3 parts in, and the story has carried us from a reconnaissance report on a humid Formosa morning to the largest naval battle in history. We watched Task Force 38 erase Japan's 2nd Air Fleet in 15 minutes. We watched James Flatley fight his own navy to prove that coordinated section tactics could transform a group of individual pilots into a system that killed at 13-to-1 ratios. We watched the Musashi 72,000 tons of the finest steel Japan ever produced sink under the weight of 19 torpedo hits delivered by carrier aircraft that never came within visual range of their target. We watched Toyota sacrifice his own carriers as bait because he had run out of every other option. But here is the question that the after-action reports never answered. What happened to the men who built all of this? And what did it cost them personally to be right when everyone around them was certain they were wrong? James Flatley came home in the spring of 1945 with the rank of captain and a chest full of citations that described in the careful passive language of official commendation contributions to carrier fighter doctrine that materially improved combat effectiveness. The citations did not say that his manual, the one Commander Bauer slid back across the desk in October 1943, had been replicated and distributed to every carrier air group in the Pacific Fleet. They did not say that the tactics he developed in 6 weeks aboard Yorktown had become the foundational doctrine against which Japanese air power was measured and found permanently wanting. Official commendations rarely capture the distance between where an idea started and where it ended up. Flatley returned to his home in Rockville Center, New York in August 1945, 3 days after Japan announced its surrender. His wife had been managing the household and raising their children for most of 3 years with letters and silence as her primary sources of information about whether her husband was alive. He walked through his front door on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a duffel bag and wearing a uniform that needed pressing. His youngest child, who had been 2 years old when he last saw her, did not recognize him immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she did. That moment, which lasted perhaps 4 seconds, contained everything that the strategic summaries and kill ratio statistics and carrier doctrine manuals could not. Commander Bauer, the officer who had dismissed Flatley's manual, had by 1945 revised his position so completely that he was actively citing the coordinated section tactics doctrine in his own reports as evidence of American tactical superiority. This is not an unusual trajectory for institutional resistance. The pattern repeats throughout military history with a regularity that should be more instructive than it generally is. The idea is rejected. The idea proves itself under combat conditions. The people who rejected it incorporate it into their professional identity, as though the rejection never happened. Flatley, who was not a vindictive man by temperament, did not appear to hold this against Bauer. He had what he wanted, which was pilots coming home alive in numbers that the 1942 casualty rates had made unimaginable. Flatley stayed in the Navy after the war, rising to vice admiral before his retirement in 1958. He died in 1958, younger than he should have at 51 years old. The Navy named a destroyer escort after him. USS Flatley, commissioned in 1968, served until 1990. 22 years of active service carrying his name through the waters where his doctrine had first proven itself. There are worse epitaphs for a career built on the conviction that how you fight matters as much as what you fight with. The doctrine he developed did not retire when he did. Coordinated section tactics refined and expanded through the Korean War and the early years of Vietnam became the structural basis for every American fighter combat training program developed in the following decades. When the Navy established the Naval Fighter Weapons School at Miramar, California in 1969, the school that became famous as Top Gun, its curriculum was built on the foundational principle that Flatley had articulated in that Pearl Harbor pamphlet in 1943. No pilot fights alone. Every engagement is a team problem. Individual brilliance is subordinate to systematic coordination. The school was created specifically because Vietnam-era kill ratios had declined to approximately 2-to-1, a collapse. That analysis traced directly to a generation of pilots who had been trained on missiles and radar intercepts and had lost proficiency in the close-range maneuvering combat that Flatley's doctrine addressed. Top Gun restored the ratio to 13-to-1 by the end of Vietnam. The same number, the same principle. 25 years later. The Essex-class carriers, the ships that made Task Force 38 possible, had a service life that exceeded every projection made during their wartime construction. Several served into the 1970s. USS Intrepid, which had launched strikes against the Sibuyan Sea and contributed to the sinking of the Musashi, served until 1974, and is now a museum anchored on the Hudson River in New York City. If you stand on her flight deck today, you can walk the same steel that Flatley's pilots walked before launching into the morning above Formosa on October 12, 1944. The deck is worn smooth in the places where the most feet have passed. The catapult tracks are still visible. The island superstructure looks out over the Manhattan skyline instead of the Philippine Sea. The geometry of the ship, the relationship between deck space and hangar space, and the positioning of the island is recognizably the template for every American carrier built in the 8 decades since. The United States Navy currently operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. The Gerald R. Ford class, the most recent, displaces 100,000 tons and carries approximately 90 aircraft. The operational concept, a mobile airfield that projects striking power against targets 300 miles from its position, is identical to the concept that the Newport News shipyard was building toward in 1941 when they laid the keel of the original Essex. The technology is unrecognizable. The principle is unchanged. 24 Essex-class carriers built during the war. 11 supercarriers operating today. The line between them is direct, unbroken, and runs straight through the industrial decisions made in the first weeks after Pearl Harbor, when someone in Washington decided that the answer to Japan's carrier aviation was not to match it ship for ship, but to overwhelm it with a production rate that no other nation on Earth could approach. The BII Hawk buried inside this story is not primarily about aircraft or tactics or carrier design. Those are the visible layer. The deeper lesson is about what happens when an institution faces a genuinely new problem and must choose between the comfort of established procedure and the discomfort of admitting that the established procedure is wrong. The Imperial Japanese Navy in 1944 was not short of courage. Japanese pilots flew into American anti-aircraft screens knowing the survival probability. Japanese sailors at Leyte Gulf charged destroyers with battleships and accepted the chaos that followed. The deficit was not bravery. The deficit was the institutional capacity to look at changing conditions and change in response. Japanese carrier doctrine assumed that the decisive factor in air combat was pilot skill. When American pilots with 300 training hours began killing Japanese pilots with 800 training hours at 13-to-1 ratios, the doctrine should have been revised. It was not revised partly because the pilots who could have informed the revision were dead, and partly because institutions under existential pressure tend to double down on familiar approaches rather than abandon them for untested alternatives. The Americans had the same institutional resistance. Bauer sliding that manual back across the desk was not a unique event. It was the normal response of a system defending its accumulated expertise against a challenge from someone who lacked the seniority to be taken seriously. What made the difference was Mitcher, one admiral willing to give a junior officer 6 weeks and 1 air group and a conditional promise. That is a narrow enough margin that it is genuinely unsettling to consider what the Pacific War might have looked like without it. History turns on smaller pivots than people prefer to believe. Now, here is the detail that most accounts of Task Force 38 and the Battle of Leyte Gulf do not include the piece that changes the texture of everything that came before it. When Ozawa sailed his decoy carriers south in October 1944, he carried with him a final air group of approximately 108 aircraft and pilots who understood they were being sent to die. Ozawa himself, in a post-war interview conducted by American naval historians in 1946, was asked whether he believed the Showan plan had any realistic chance of succeeding. He answered without hesitation. He said the plan had a realistic chance of delaying the fall of the Philippines by perhaps 90 days. He said 90 days was worth 4 carriers and their air groups because 90 days of continued access to Philippine oil supply lines was the difference between a Japanese fleet that could maneuver and a Japanese fleet that could only sit. He said he had told his pilots the truth about their mission before they sailed, and he said that they had sailed anyway. The American pilots who intercepted Ozawa's decoy force on October 25th and destroyed all 4 carriers in a single day's fighting did not know they were killing men who had been told in advance that survival was not the mission. They were doing their jobs with the efficiency that Flatley's doctrine and Essex hulls and Grumman engineering had made possible. The symmetry is not comfortable. On one side, a system optimized for survival and repeated effectiveness carriers that launched and recovered and launched again, pilots who came home and flew the next morning. On the other side, men who sailed, knowing they were the bait in a trap, who flew their final missions. Understanding the mathematics as clearly as Omae had understood them on Formosa 2 weeks earlier. From a lieutenant with a pamphlet that his commanding officer refused to finish reading to a doctrine that transformed the kill ratio from parity to 13-1 to 17 carriers that could appear off any coastline in the Western Pacific with 15 minutes warning, James Flatley and the men and women who built the Essex-class in round-the-clock shipyard shifts proved that the decisive factor in industrial-age warfare is not the quality of any single weapon or any single pilot, but the capacity to build, train, and sustain faster than the enemy can destroy. Task Force 38 sank or destroyed more than 300 Japanese warships and over 3,000 aircraft between February and October 1944. It did this while losing 0 fleet carriers to enemy action, and the margin between those two numbers, between what was built and what was lost, was bought in shipyards in Newport News and flight schools in Pensacola, and on a carrier deck in Pearl Harbor, where a 26-year-old lieutenant refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the way things had to be done. The most dangerous weapon in the history of naval warfare was not the carrier. It was the willingness to be wrong about everything you thought you knew and to change before the enemy made the decision for you.